He walked into my office and he slid two pictures across the desk that he had taken on the side of the mountain. One was a urine stain in the snow, and the other were cigarette butts that had been smoked partially. At least one of those individuals had been alive long enough to go to the bathroom and smoke a couple of cigarettes waiting for somebody to come for them. And they never came.
What would happen if we as leaders adopted the perspective that no one else is coming to solve the problems around us? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Scott Mann. Mann is a retired lieutenant colonel and former U.S. Army Green Beret with combat tours across the world, including stints in Colombia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Based largely on his military experiences as a Special Forces soldier, Mann created a leadership consultancy called Rooftop Leadership. Now, when you learn that a military leader has created a leadership consultancy, you might have some assumptions about the philosophy that company would have. And those assumptions might be wrong. What's the greatest lever of leadership that Rooftop Leadership coaches its clients on? Answer: deep relationships. Rooftop is passionate about fostering better human connection when the stakes are high and trust is low. And who of us couldn't use a little more of that? But Scott Mann is not a one-trick pony. In fact, he is a many-trick pony. In addition to coaching and speaking on leadership, he is a New York Times best-selling author, a nonprofit founder, and an accomplished playwright and actor. During our discussion, Mann shares about a dark moment in his own life that put on display the need for leaders to proactively develop their inner worlds, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. You'll hear about a group of soldiers who were in harm's way and might have been saved, but weren't, and how that experience motivated the writing of Mann's latest book. And you'll hear how John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy, now that's quite a trio, you'll hear how they work together to make leaders more effective. But first, we get to hear about something extraordinarily unique: the upcoming premiere of a courageous one-person play that Scott Mann is about to share with the world. Here we go.
So the name of the play is 11 Days, the story of Operation Pineapple Express. It's a one-act play that I have written and I'm performing. It's based on that book that chronicled the withdrawal and the botched evacuation of our allies. And more importantly, I think the efforts that a range of volunteers made in order to try to help our allies get out when our institutional leaders failed. And that's what the play's about. I mean, the reason I wanted to do it, to maybe get to the why right out of the gate, is that I felt like, it's 5 years. In 2026, it will be the 5th year anniversary of the botched Afghanistan withdrawal. It will be the 25th anniversary of 9/11, and it will be the 250th anniversary of our nation. And I thought, well, that's quite a year, and as a storyteller, I felt like the book did a lot to help tell the story. I hope that it's a film one day, but I also, just through my experience of Last Out and doing that play about the Afghanistan war, I thought, man, I need to do a play that tells how it ended, from the veterans' perspective, from the Afghans' perspective, not this stuff you saw in the media and the politicians, but like a real, and even my testimony that I did to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, they gave me 5 minutes, man, to unpack a 20-year war. And I'm like, nope, I'm going to testify for real this time. It's going to be in my backyard. That's going to be the setting, but it's also going to be Abbey Gate where the bomb went off. That's going to be the setting for the play. And I'm going to testify about how far would people go to honor a promise? How far would veterans go to honor a promise? How far would our Afghan allies go to honor a promise versus we saw how far our politicians would go? So this play is about telling the story of the volunteers in Pineapple Express, a few of them, and their allies, and how far they went to honor this promise with each other. It hits hard, man.
So the book, Operation Pineapple Express, chronicles all that was happening that went down at the end, if I could, kind of oversimplify there. And this is the one act play. Why you took the time to write the book? What is it about bringing it to the stage that is important from your perspective?
It's oral storytelling. I think that anytime we want to communicate something important, it doesn't have to be anything about veterans or Afghanistan. I think it's for all of us. Oral storytelling is the oldest form of communication in the world. It's been around for 100,000 years. The latest neuroscience studies show that our brain does not process raw data. It does not process PowerPoint or spreadsheets. It uses metaphor and pattern to make sense of things. In other words, our brain tells itself a story to make sense of things. It is a sense-making tool, and oral storytelling is the oldest, most impactful way of doing it. I love to speak, but there's nothing like telling a story from the stage, fully embodied, so that the audience can locate themselves in the story and go for the ride emotionally.
Yeah. Well, let's get the details out there. Let's get dates and locations. So in case somebody who's listening has a chance to catch it, that they know where they need to be and when they need to be there.
If you go to tfpineapple.org, you can get tickets there. And the world premiere is going to be in Tampa, Florida, HCC Performing Arts Center. It'll be the main stage theater, and it will be December 17 through December 20 of 2025. And we do a talk back after each show. We're going to tour the country, Tim, in 2026. We're putting the tour together right now. If folks just go to tfpineapple.org or scottmann.com, you'll be able to see the tour dates just as soon as we get them posted.
Well, this has given us a little peek behind the curtain on your process and what's coming up. I'm very excited about this thing going live and everybody getting a chance to experience not only your mind, but your heart and soul as well. And that actually serves as a pretty good transition for us, because I know of a topic that has your heart and soul as well, and that is the topic of leadership. Talk to us a little bit about what first got you ignited about leadership. What drew you to it as something important?
My dad, to this day, he still is the greatest leader I've ever known. And I've seen some good ones, man, but he is the greatest leader I've ever known. And his approach to leadership and the way he just carried himself infected me before I even realized it as a child. I have memories of, he was a forest ranger, and I can remember the old grizzly, gnarled, surly firefighting teams that would come from out west and stay at the work center down from our house, our government ranger house. And they would surround my dad every second of every day. They just wanted to be around him, and they loved talking to him, and he loved them. And it was before I even realized that what he was doing was just being a great leader. I can't remember not remembering that.
Well, what a blessing, A. So congratulations on that being a part of your life. But if you go a little bit further into it with the perspective that you get to have now, what was it that caused people to want to gather around and be around and just lean in to your dad?
I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it. I'm not, folks, this is not a paid advertisement. He was inwardly sound and he was others focused. And I say that because when I read that in your book, it literally stopped me and it brought me to tears. Because for most of my adult life, I have been looking for a description of a leader that was worth following. And I've tried to tell young officers what it is. And in that moment, when I read it, it slammed me. And when I look back on Dad and his approach to leadership and why those men loved him so much, and just, I'm not kidding you, man. The stuff that my dad got done on fires, he ended up being like the top wildland firefighter guy in the country under George W. Bush. And it was because of the people that he served and what they got done. And it was because he was inwardly sound and he was others focused.
Well, again, I'll repeat myself. What a blessing that you got to have that front row seat to that and also get to be on the receiving end of that. Servant leadership gets a lot of play, and rightly so. It's very valuable. But I think when we skip the inwardly sound side of it, I think we've got to become more inwardly sound so that we can be others focused. Otherwise, I think there's we run into ourselves accidentally when we don't do that inwardly sound work ahead of time.
That's why I think it was so profound for me when I read that in The Only Leaders Worth Following, was because I had spent a lot of my life, particularly coming back from war as a Green Beret, and I had a lot of guilt of loss of people who left this world doing things that I asked them to do, or missions that I created, or targets that I would put them on. And they would go to those targets with, my last memory of them is on a chopper or walking to the chopper, giving me the hang loose sign with a big grin on their face, and
Mm.
you come home with that and it doesn't leave you. So what I found was if I just did a bunch of stuff for other people, I didn't have to tolerate myself very much. I didn't have to be around myself. I could just pour myself into other people. It's like a Delta trooper told me one time. He said, "Sir, I'm like a great white. If I sit still, I die." And, that really hit me. But I wasn't inwardly sound. I had deferred the work on myself coming home because I couldn't tolerate myself. I couldn't sit with myself and have those feelings that had grown so painful. And so I would just focus on other people. And that has a shadow side to it, man. And it wasn't until a very, very dark moment in my life that I talk about in the book, I think is when I started to do work on me too. Mostly just by God's grace that happened. It wasn't like me saying, "Oh, it's time to work on me." Like it was a gift. We can pour ourselves into other people and be servant leaders, but if we're not wired tight on the inside, there's going to be a cost that ultimately ends up probably going back to some form of resentment.
Wow. And you're saying, like, I didn't necessarily set out to work on the insides of who I am, but I did, and it made all the difference. I think what's so valuable for the rest of us to hear that is you may not have consciously gone into that direction, but you ended up there. And now, 2020 hindsight, you can turn around and look back at it, which is essentially an invitation for the rest of us to not stumble into that, but to intentionally and purposely go after it, to intentionally and purposely prioritize working on becoming more inwardly sound. So your story didn't come with that conscious intentionality at first, but now it can still bless the rest of us by saying, hey, if you really want to serve and lead, if you really want to be others focused, this is foundational to work on. So thanks for sharing that part of your story.
Well, I mean, I have a grammar for it now. Like, how there's things in our life that we know to be true, but we don't have a language for them. Tell your spouse or your child, "I love you." "Why do you love me?" Uh, and it's not that you don't have a million reasons, but it's because you have a million reasons. And it's hard to have a language for something that profound. And that part of our brain struggles with that, But when we are gifted with a grammar to talk about something that is highly emotional and that typically eludes language, that's when we are really we have an open runway. When I went through that dark period of my life, I knew something was wrong. I knew there was something wrong inside of me, but I didn't have a language for it. I didn't know where to start. And honestly, it's been a couple of mentors in my life, a couple of folks that offered a grammar to understand this better, yours being the only leaders worth following. And then probably my acting coach, Carl, who really helped me in some dark moments, Bo, Jason, they were all civilians. It's the funniest thing, who just had a certain comprehension of what it was that I was wrestling with and offered a language to make sense of it. Because the brain is a sense-making organ. So when I read Inwardly Sound, Other Focus, when Carl said to me, "You're having trouble tolerating yourself. That's why your feet shift when you're doing scenes from your play. You can't tolerate yourself." And I was like, "How the hell do you know that?" But it gave me this wonderful language of making sense of what I was dealing with. And I think that's probably for all of us, the greatest news of all is that there's actually an emerging grammar for these challenging times that we're in and how we can work on ourselves and how we can be connected to other people. And I hope that my book does that too. That was really my goal, was to offer another form of language to think about the challenges we face and how we can connect better to humans.
I've been affected by those kinds of things as well. And in the midst of all of this kind of conversation around leadership, one of the things that I want to be really clear with people about is that in the midst of writing, I'm not an inventor. I'm not inventing anything. I'm a reporter. I'm going to tell you what the research says, and I'm going to attempt to put words to it so that we can have some handles to do something about it. But I think it's so important to understand whether, regardless of what it is, when we tap into those deeper, true things of life, It's not something that, oh, by the way, this happens to be popular. No, it's about something that's actually always been true, is true, and will always be true. And so there's a grounding in that to say this isn't about some latest trend. This is about something that's deeply true about human beings. And therefore, we're not inventing anything.
Exactly.
We're just
That's well
reporting on
said.
it, and now let's name it, and so we can do something about it. So
That's right. That's
yeah.
right. And it's a context and framework by which you can get down to work.
Yes, good. Well, that's hey, there between the mention of the book a moment ago and that comment, it's a good bridge. So let's get into Nobody is Coming to Save You. I love the title. This is one of those books where if I didn't read past the title, it's valuable. Seriously, I just read the title and it impacts my framework as a leader. Okay, I can't just sit around and wait. I think it's especially important for folks who may be a little bit earlier in their careers and lives to have this mentality that I'm going to take responsibility for what's going on. And I mean that in all the best ways. Sometimes we hear responsibility, we get nervous, like, well, no, I'm going to make sure that I do something about this. And I'm not just going to sit around and wait for a cavalry to come that's not coming. So before we get into the content of the book, and maybe this will be related, but why did you have to write this? What is it that drove you to say, we need to talk about the fact that nobody's coming to save you?
For me, it runs very deep. It's a story actually that's not in the book. And it was when I was a young special forces officer on my first deployment to Afghanistan. We had just arrived in country and there was a crash of a Blackwater Casa 212 aircraft on a mountain in the Hindu Kush up in the central highlands of the country. I mean, like 13,000 feet. And it was carrying Army troops, and a couple of contractors from Blackwater were flying it. And the reason I knew that is because I was the operations officer for the Special Forces Battalion in the South. So we had a lot of teams operating in the South and the West of the country. And the way we communicate across the country is we have a satellite radio that every unit across the country can hear whenever something happens. And then when something is a crisis, you clear the net and whoever's in that crisis works. It's the only form of comms that you can talk countrywide unimpeded. And so everybody heard that this Casa 212 had gone down. Everybody heard that there were beacons on the side of the mountain, which means there were, possible survivors. And then everybody knew by having worked in Afghanistan that at 13,000 feet in November, you don't have a lot of time. And so it was way north of us. And there were, my assumption as the operations officer focused on the West and the South and keeping my guys on mission and alive was that somebody in the North would handle that. And that's just kind of how you deal with it. But one of my team sergeants, Mark, walked in and was pretty adamant. He was an old crusty, gnarled team sergeant, smoked like a chimney. And he was like, hey, sir, my team is personnel recovery certified. We just did cold weather and high altitude training before we came here. We got to get up there. There's going to be survivors on that mountain. And my response to him was the typical right response that a staff officer would give a sergeant that he had known for years in that moment. Mark, I appreciate it. That's not our area of operations. Somebody else has got that. We need to focus on our area. Sir, nobody's coming for those guys. I'm telling you, I've been in this game a long time. And so I just told him, look, I appreciate it, but, and he left, but he wasn't happy. And then, fast forward over the next day or so, every couple of hours, you would hear people talking about the wreckage, but no action was happening. Nobody was moving. Nobody was mobilizing. And Mark just kept coming over and staring at me. And finally, after 24 hours or so, he was adamant. He walked in. He's like, sir, either you go bottom up and you get somebody to get us up there, or I'm going directly to the commander myself. And I was like, all right, dude, I got it. And so I got on the phone and got pretty aggressive and did what I'm capable of doing and got an invitation and convinced the powers that be that Mark and his team could get up there and they could do the job. And ultimately, a lot of hand wringing, a lot of risk aversion. Finally, like 3 days later, they got up there at 12,000, 13,000 feet. It was very touch and go. The whole team got altitude sickness. They found the wreckage. It was really worrisome. We lost comms with them at points, but they ended up, there were no survivors. They recovered everybody. They brought them down the mountain. They brought the black box. They even brought their mail and personal effects. I mean, so that the families could have that. And when they got back to Kandahar, Mark walked in and I didn't really know what to say to him. I knew he was going to be upset that there were no survivors, but he walked into my office and he slid 2 pictures across the desk that he had taken on the side of the mountain. One was a urine stain in the snow, and the other were cigarette butts that had been smoked partially. at least one of those individuals had been alive long enough to go to the bathroom and smoke a couple of cigarettes waiting for somebody to come for them. And they never came. And he looked at me and he said nothing. And he walked out. Mark's gone now. He passed away this year. But I never, ever forgot that. It hit me so hard, and it made me reevaluate everything. And I thought, man, my dad would have gone immediately if one of his guys came and said that. And so I just swore to myself, like, that will never happen again. If I see that something is wrong systemically and nobody's coming, I'm going to say something. And it was really what I think drove me to get involved with Pineapple Express, when a lot of folks were telling me to stand down. A lot of generals were saying, watch your back. FBI agents coming to my house. And I believe in this country, that's where we are today. I believe we are in a place in this country right now that the levels of what I call the churn are so bad, in the disengagement, the distraction, the absence of purpose, the way we're treating each other with contempt normally reserved for one's enemies, that we are on the precipice of some really bad stuff at community and even national levels if we don't figure out how to connect and get big stuff done from the bottom up. Like, nobody's coming to fix this. I don't care who's in office. I don't care who is in charge. That's not the solution. The solution are people like you and me and our neighbors recognizing that nobody's coming to fix this and taking responsible action at a local level to build stronger social capital in this country. And that's, I believe it in my heart, And so I know that was a long way around, man, but that is the impetus of this book.
No, I mean, it's profound to have the privilege of knowing that story and for you to have shared it with us. And
I've never told it on a podcast, so ever.
Thank you for, I'm over here managing myself a little bit in terms of the meaning of an experience like that. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing it with us.
And I owe it to Mark, and I owe it to his family and and the guys, that went up there and did that, to just be honest about how effective it was, how much of an effect it had on me. And I do believe that the antibody to the division and churn that we face today, certainly a different kind of threat than they faced on that mountain, but it's just as dangerous. And I believe that the antibody to it is human connection.
Well, then let's talk about that a little bit. As you think about human connection, if I were to take a typical civilian perspective on Green Berets, I don't know that human connection would be the first thing that they would think about. So talk a little bit about that, because that's your background here. Talk about how human connection plays into all of this from your perspective.
Well, I think it's because most people, and it's understandable, have a vision of what a Green Beret is. That's kind of the urban legend that is associated with Navy SEALs and Delta Force and Army Rangers and all that door kicking stuff. And we do some of that. But what a lot of people don't know is that the origins of Green Berets, or as they're formerly known, Special Forces from the Army, actually goes all the way back to World War II. In World War II, in Nazi-occupied Europe, it was very clear that there needed to be kind of a bottom-up, unconventional approach to disrupting the Nazi effort. And we knew ultimately we were going to invade Europe. We were going to take it back, but we needed kind of an inside-out approach. And they stood up this organization called the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. And they took volunteers, and they were mostly lawyers and school teachers who went through this immensely tough training to become combat advisors. They would work by, with, and through the partisans of France and Belgium and all these occupied countries. And they would help them organize, recruit, train, formulate a resistance, and then they would stay with them for the entire length of the war and fight subversion and sabotage from the inside out. And they called them Jedburgh teams. Those were the origins of not just the Special Forces, the Green Berets, but also the CIA. After World War II ended, the OSS was disbanded. The intelligence arm formed the CIA, and the operational arm formed U.S. Army Special Forces. And so in 1952, we became U.S. Army Special Forces. But we'd been doing this work, all the way back to 42. And then you started to see Green Berets in Korea, Vietnam, doing the same thing, except in Vietnam, they were working with Montagnards, the Central Highlander tribes, to fight against the Viet Cong. And then you saw them working with forces in Panama, the Philippines, On any given day, Green Berets are working in 65 countries around the world, combat advising, providing support to foreign militaries. And then when the war on terror happened, we primarily focused on Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And we were working very closely with villagers to stand up for their own communities, as well as Afghan commandos and special forces. So the way I tell people, like, what's different about an Army Green Beret is they're a combination of John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy.
That's a fascinating combination, those three.
Well, if you think about it, Green Berets, they have to go to low trust, high risk places. Nobody's coming. They're the only ones around. And then they have to build relationships with these locals and then organize them to fight back on their own from the bottom up. Whereas Navy SEALs, they'll roll in, and I'm not minimizing what SEALs do. I mean, they roll in on a target. They killed bin Laden, for goodness sake, right? They roll in on a target hot. They take the target down. They come off the target very quickly. They usually do the target by themselves unilaterally, right? That's the specific mission set of most special operations forces. Green Berets, they work by, with, and through indigenous people, and they go in with 12 and they come out with 1,200, right? It's like kind of a modern day Magnificent Seven. So that's the context. Well, then you've got to have a very, very uniquely qualified individual who has to be John Wick. In other words, if you watch the John Wick movies, John is very lethal, but he's surgically lethal. He doesn't blow up the city. He targets the one or two individuals that are in his path. And there's a general reluctance to John Wick that he doesn't just go out and whack people. I mean, he used to, but he's left that world. And the only reason he got involved in the first place, somebody killed his dog. Right? I mean, like, there's a general reluctance because he knows the surgical lethality he wields. And that's at the baseline of every Green Beret. They are extremely proficient at surgical lethality, very good at it. But they're usually older and they understand the application of it and what it usually results in. So they reserve it for the last option. They're also Lawrence of Arabia. T.E. Lawrence was a British intelligence officer during World War I, and in 1917, before that, he was a geologist who had worked extensively in modern-day Syria and Iraq and had built deep relationships of not just the tribes there, but of the microculture. He understood, for example, in Aqaba, the crown jewel of the Ottoman Empire, while he was doing geology, that all the guns of Aqaba faced the ocean. It was considered to be impenetrable. So the Allies didn't even try to take it. Well, he knew that the one place the guns didn't point was toward the Sahara Desert because he had been in Aqaba for years. And he also knew that there were tribes that transited the Sahara Desert all the time. And if he could unify those tribes and mobilize them to take Aqaba, the crown jewel of the Ottoman Empire, from the 6 o'clock, then that would be a major economy of force for the Allies. And so he went into this area by himself, built social capital and rapport and relationships, and with tribes that would normally not sit in the same tent without unsheathing their knives. But he used storytelling as a way to illuminate hope and what could be, which was liberating the city of Aqaba. And imagine what that would look like if these Badu tribesmen could liberate that city. And I call that the Lawrencian skill set. And then finally is the Verizon guy. The Verizon guy, if you remember the commercials, he'd pop up out of a manhole cover. Can you hear me now? Good. You'd see him in the jungle. Can you hear me now? Good. He had a metaphorical obsession with connection. He was always building his network. If you go and you look at some old school Green Beret down in Bogota, Colombia, that guy will be like in a flop hat and working with Colombian special forces in their uniform with a big dip of Copenhagen in his mouth. But the next day, you'll meet that dude at the embassy in Bogota and he'll walk you into the ambassador's office in a three-piece suit. He has these vast connections that spread from tactical to strategic, and he's obsessed with building networks that can be leveraged in a crisis. And so all of those are necessary ingredients in the modern Green Beret, and then they're woven into these cocktails for the different situations. I believe that's what leaders have to be today, is some version of that. We have to have some version of surgical coercion, not lethality, but we need to be able to carry the big stick. We need to have those Lawrencian skills to build social capital and human connection as a centerpiece. And we've got to build networks. We've got to be really good at building networks so that we can get stuff done from the bottom up. We can bring the power of a diverse network to bear on a wicked problem. And I just think all of those are useful avatars. And there's a whole body of work that goes with each one of them. And I've been blessed to spend 30 years of my life developing that body of work. And now I get to share it with leaders at home. And it's just really exciting.
That takes me to so many places, but I want to say, as we all hear that description of the book, to me, it becomes very obvious why we should listen to a Green Beret about leadership, and that it applies not just in military environments. It applies really in any space where somebody might lead. Let's come back to Lawrence of Arabia and the Verizon guy for a moment, because you've got people deeply involved. I wonder if you might kind of open for us a little bit further the difference between the two, because one is these networks where you're talking about with the Verizon guy, and the other one's very social with people. If I want to have a distinction between Lawrence of Arabia and the Verizon guy, how do I think about social interaction and connection as different than networks? And then how do I approach them, because they are different things?
Great question. And love that we're getting into this level of it. So let me just bring it back to what Lawrence did, right? So T.E. Lawrence would sit in the tent with these Baddu elders, the nomads, and he would build relationships with them. He would build trust with them. He would tell stories. He would listen to stories. He was absolutely brilliant at interpersonal skills. He could build relationships and bridge across tribal gaps that the tribal leaders couldn't do. He was brought in to resolve disputes that the tribal leaders didn't feel like they could resolve because they were too entrenched. And he found that he could play a role as a third-party advisor, as a catalyst, but he had to have good relationships with everybody. He couldn't necessarily take a side with one tribe. In fact, that was one of the things he always said was, in my kind of role, you never want to invest in just one tribe. You want to have relationships with multiple constituents. But it was the interpersonal skills, the active listening, the narrative competence of storytelling, the nonverbal physicality that he was able to demonstrate, and frankly, the relationship management that he is remembered for, he is studied for at our headquarters in the Special Operations Schoolhouse. And I call the skills, I hate the term soft skills. I just don't like it.
Yeah.
Because in corporate America, what it means to me is the hard skills. I mean, even in this book, and I love the book, The Little Book of Talent by Daniel Coyle, he talks about how we should always practice the hard skills first. And I don't necessarily agree with that. In some situations, yes, but the soft skills of rapport building, empathy, reciprocity, storytelling, active listening, those are all, if you think about it, the things that authentically influence humans to do things they otherwise wouldn't do. So why would you practice those last? Why would that be the afterthought for your HR office at the end of the quarter because you didn't do your soft skill training? Like, I mean, I think we have, that's why I call them Lawrencian skills. T.E. Lawrence he was massively recognized for valor. He was decorated for valor time and time again. That's not what he's remembered for. He's remembered for the interpersonal skill set that he put in play as one individual that literally defeated the Ottoman Empire. Now, that is a return on investment. And I believe that Lawrencian skill set of old school human connection skills that our grandparents were good at, that's what I'm talking about when I invoke the avatar of Lawrence. But it's not just the instinct, because a lot of people have instinct. You can't teach instinct. You can only execute instinct. There is both an art and a science to Lawrencian skills. There is instinct and there's skill. And so I believe you have to train on the interpersonal skill set. Now, go to the Verizon guy. He's my metaphor for the manifestation of that skill set. If you're good at it and you have an appreciation that most problems you face today, whether you're a nonprofit leader or whether you are a business founder or work in corporate America, most of the problems you're going to face are wicked, ill-structured problems that exceed the scope and capacity of you and your team. It's a wicked problem. It's ill-structured, which means it's going to require multiple constituents to even begin to solve it. That brings with it an organizational complexity that normally kicks our butt because all of our primal responses come in of in-groups and out-groups. And I hate the budget department because I'm in the ops department. And I call them modern day shovel fights, right? And so all of our primal realities press on us and prevent us from bridging and creating these expansive networks that can actually swarm on a problem. It's very rare to find an individual who's built a network, like I said, that Green Beret, who can be out in the jungle one day and walk in the halls of the embassy the next day and do a high five with like the minister of defense in that country, because he knew him when he was a private. But that's available to all of us. And if you look at Pineapple Express, that was a Verizon guy network that we built for 20 years. But what people are usually surprised at is, my goodness, what a network. And what I tell them is that network, the rule of building a Verizon guy network is you build trust when risk is low and you leverage it when the stakes are high. And so it's this combination of Lawrence and the Verizon guy. Lawrence being the interpersonal skills that let you build social capital and rapport. But it's not just for the sake of rapport. It actually is to construct a network or an ecosystem that is relevant to the things you're trying to solve in life. It's different for everybody, but I guarantee you there's utility in having relationships with the person that you see every day in your office. But there's also people outside your organization that could play a major role in whatever it is you're trying to solve. And you got to have them in that ecosystem too. That's the Verizon guy piece of it. And that's the part that normally eludes us the most.
As I think about the instinct that you talk about around the Lawrence of Arabia character and those capabilities, I could see somebody being really naturally capable there and then even enhancing those through skill development, but not necessarily then making that next step, which is I need to take this capability and build other networks besides just the places where I'm naturally going to show up and naturally going to be. And that's what makes the Verizon guy so important. Am I understanding that correctly?
You could not be more accurate in that. And that's why if you notice in the chapters, the way on Nobody's Coming to Save You, I say that at a primal level, we have to understand the human operating system, right? If you're really going to influence people, you got to understand that we're meaning-seeking, emotional, social storytellers who struggle. We're a mess. But it's a very primal thing. We haven't changed in a lot of thousands of years. If you notice in the chapter on social connection, I take a lot of time to talk about that Verizon guy network. I call it a community of practice. And communities of practice are multidisciplined, multicultural communities, virtual and physical, that exist around a single wicked problem that everybody wants to solve, but for different reasons. Like an example outside industry would be in Afghanistan, and we were doing that village program. We all wanted stability in Afghanistan, but I helped build a community of practice that included USAID, State Department, Doctors Without Borders. Everybody agreed that stability in these rural villages was a problem, but they were all coming at it from very different points of view and would normally not exist in the same ecosystem. So you have to create conditions where these various constituents come together, and it's the problem that unifies them. It's focus on that wicked problem. And if you can be that Verizon guy that's the catalyst that can hold them together around that problem, that's when you play at a whole different level than anybody else. And that's what I think you're right, it eludes people because it is difficult.
Yeah. So we're all a mess with 3 S's. And if we can take each of those things into account, we've got for lack of a better way of saying, we've got a fighting chance. As you do the work, one of the things that's unique about you is it's not like you just wrote this one book. We've talked about Operation Pineapple Express. You're in the playwriting business as well. You have a willingness to dig into yourself and then pour it out in word. You've done so many things. You've got other things that are in the works currently. How did that idea of sharing who you are, how did that get birthed to the point where you're now an author and a playwright and doing all the things that you're doing?
I think it came to me in my darkest moment when I was going through a lot of mental health stuff between 2013 and 2015 when I got out of the military. And I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do now? Is this it? 41 years old? Yeah, I wanted to be a Green Beret since I was 14, and that was my dream, but it's over. That dream's done. The uniform's off. Now I'm walking around my house in a robe, and I haven't showered or shaved in 2 weeks. And my boys get up and walk out of the room every time I walk in because they don't know what version of dad they're going to get. I'm wallowing in my survivor's guilt and all the stuff I brought home, and I have done nothing about it, right? So I just started to lose my purpose and my identity and my meaning, and almost took my life. And it was the grace of God that I didn't, on some things that happened that day. But what happened on the other side of it, for me, is the real miracle, is that I was introduced to a couple of civilian mentors who reacquainted me with storytelling in a way that I had never experienced it. And it was all built around this idea of struggle, this idea of that we all struggle, and that struggle and the current understanding of being of a liability is just not true, that actually there is a tremendous amount of potential and has been for thousands of years that we can take our struggles and repurpose them through stories in the service of others. In other words, those scars that are even still open, that a lot of people don't see, that we hide from the world, that we hide from ourselves. I started to see as I worked through my story and I started to heal myself. I started to experience an alignment between my lived experience and the narrative that contained it. And those isolated white hot memories of trauma and guilt all of a sudden started to open up into a bigger narrative, that things like even Mark coming in and sliding those pictures across the table. I mean, that wasn't like he never talked to me again. We had a great relationship and I was friends with him for years. Like, you know what I mean? So the narrative exploration gave me the ability to heal myself and then as a vehicle to bridge other people. And I started calling that the generosity of scars. This idea that we all have scars. It's a universal singular. It's a biological necessity, as Daniel Coyle says, but we can repurpose them. There's generosity if you think about it, when you're telling your story, where do most people actually locate you in the story? Where do they connect with you? It's in the struggle. Right? It's not in the lesson. It's when they realize that you've been scuffed up like they have. Mm-hmm. And they think, oh, wow, man, I'm not alone. If Tim can do that, I can do that. And then all of a sudden there's this reciprocity that's in place where you just want to go up and talk to that person. You just want to learn more about them. You want to stand up at the end of the TED Talk when everybody does it at the same time without prompting. There's generosity in a scar. And I bought into that hook, line, and sinker. I started just like a good Green Beret. I obsessed over it and made it my entire body of work. So yeah, everything I do now that I put into the world, I try to come at it with the rocket fuel of a generosity of scars and just understanding that the more I make myself relatable and pull the body armor off and just share what has been my lived experience and what I've learned and how I've changed, that old 70,000 year reality of storytelling will serve me. It won't fail me. And it feels vulnerable. It feels kind of icky at times doing that. But the payload on the other side is like taking Aqaba, man. It's just amazing. You have a story and your story, you have more than one story. You have a lot of stories, but those stories the ones you don't want to tell yourself, the ones you don't want to tell the world, have the potential to change somebody's life, if not save it. And if you don't put those stories into the world, nobody's coming, right? I mean, and think about what that could mean. Make a human connection first in everything that you do, no matter what your agenda is, no matter how much of a rush that you're in, no matter how quickly you need to get to the PowerPoint deck, make a human connection first. The struggles and scars that you carry are rocket fuel for somebody else's healing. That's a real shift in thinking. But if you believe that, then there's no ceiling to what you can do in this world, no matter how dark.
I don't know what your expectations might have been when you found out that you were listening to a former Green Beret. But I am willing to guess, if you're not familiar with the Green Berets already, that you might have heard some things that surprised you a little bit. The depth and complexity of how they think about their role, all of the relationship engagement and management that is involved. And I'm so thankful that we got the curtain pulled back on that world by our friend Scott Mann. As we think about the time that we spent together, I do want to come back to, just for a moment, that connection point between Lawrence of Arabia and the Verizon guy. The idea that I am here in an interpersonal, interconnected way with people, connecting with them on a human level, but then also thinking outside of just my normal networks and knowing that there's going to be a day that comes later on where it's going to be the moment, those higher risk moments. Will those networks have been pre-built? And that brings me back to something where I want to share a little bit more with you about Scott as I have gotten to know him over the years, because I think there's a way to look at that combination of Lawrence of Arabia and the Verizon guy that he talked about. I think there's a way to look at that in almost a manipulative way, as if the relationships that are being built are not genuine, as if they're only there for the utility of the moment when they are needed. And I can tell you, after spending hours and hours with Scott Mann, that is not the way he thinks about it. That is not the type of person he is. When he talks about building these relationships, even though he recognizes that there is a point in the future when they can be leveraged for everybody's benefit, he does not go into it in a utility using kind of way. There is a genuineness to his relationship building. And I think that that's an important thing for us to keep track of, because if we're just utilizing people and trying to play a relationship game, as opposed to genuinely being in relationship with people, I think most people will be able to sniff that out over time and it will backfire. So as we had the discussion about Lawrence of Arabia, those Lawrencian skills that he talked about, and as we talk about the Verizon guys, we build these networks, I just want to put a covering over that of the word genuine. Genuine is exactly who I know Scott Mann to be, and I think it is a key component as we think about relationship building with regard to leadership and getting things done. Finally, as we wrap up today, I want to come back to the thing that Scott was mentioning there towards the end, this idea of the generosity of scars. What a unique perspective on the wounds that we all carry with us from a variety of different places. We all have them. We've all been in situations where we have been let down by somebody, we have been hurt by somebody, and we're disappointed. We have a scar. We have something that has left a mark on us that will be there in some cases for the rest of our lives. And the idea of looking at those scars with a spirit of generosity, that there is something for us to share out of those scars, what an incredible concept. And Scott isn't just talking about it, he embodies it. He embodied it as he went forward with the play Last Out, and he is embodying it all over again with this latest play that he has coming out, 11 Days. I just think it's an exceptional idea. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody talk about scars in that way. But of course, when we look at our leaders, we want to know that they're human. And one of the most human things that we can connect with those that we are following are to understand and learn about some of the scars that they have. And that's true for the people that we are leading as well. They will connect with us at a deeper and more human level if they get a chance to see and understand some of the scars that we carry with us. So that leads me to the question I want to leave you with today, and that is this. What are some scars that you could generously share with the people you lead? This is Tim Spiker reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening.